A steward brought some tea to the cabin, but Nile, the little boy, was too tired to eat the elegant sandwiches or even the cream cakes. He drank a little milk, and Orisa realized his head was nodding. The general and Lady Critchley were next door, but when they came to say good night to their grandchild, he was already fast asleep. The steward told her that dinner was to be later than usual the first night at sea. Takes times for the chef to get themselves organized, he said. But you will get good food on this ship. Do you know? The refrigeration chambers have 500 tons of meat, and there is an additional compartment that will hold 500 tons more. Good gracious! Orisa exclaimed. It sounds horrifying that we could possibly eat so much. Well, it all depends on the weather, ma'am, the steward said with a grin. People who get seasick are not hungry. He picked up the tea tray and added, but ma'am, you will enjoy yourself tonight. Orisa changed into her best evening gown. Somewhere, she remembered someone saying, first impressions are always important. People get a fixed idea of you in their minds and seldom change it. She felt a little self conscious when she was finally ready to go down to dinner, wondering whether Lady Critchley would think she was too smart or perhaps too dashing for her humble position. She had heard the General and Lady Critchley leave their cabin some minutes earlier, and she found them as she expected in the large, comfortable saloon, already holding court. Shyly, Orisa hovered on the outside of the circle when the general noticed her. Ah, Mrs. Lane, here you are, he said ponderously. I think it is time we went down to dinner. The gong sounded some moments ago. Lady Critchley said with a glance at Orisa to suggest that she was late. Then, like a ship in full sail, she led the way down the stairs to the dining saloon. As it was the first night at sea, everybody was in a good humor. There was the sound of popping champagne corks, and it seemed to Orisa as if everyone was talking at the tops of their voices in case they shouldn't be heard above the noise of the engines. Lady Critchley was on the right of the captain's empty chair, with the general next to her. Orisa sat on his right. Do you know India well, Mrs. Lane? He boomed. I have not been there for some years, she replied. Your husband is newly appointed then? The general said. I imagine he has gone ahead to get things ready for you. Yes, this is right. Orisa agreed. She longed now to ask the general what the situation had been like when he was last in India, but she felt that it might be unwise to show too obvious a knowledge of army matters. At the same time, she felt certain that sooner or later the conversation would turn from the Nile expedition to the trouble in Afghanistan. Dinner was, as the steward predicted, extremely good, and when it was finished, Lady Critchley announced, we will have coffee in the saloon. Coffee was brought by an attentive steward and the general ordered brandy for himself and the two colonels. Orisa had decided that as soon as she finished her coffee, she would be expected to retire to her cabin. She was just about to rise to her feet when she heard the general say, "Hello, Meredith. I heard you were on board. I was expecting to see you at dinner." It was with the greatest difficulty Orisa prevented herself from starting violently. At the same time, she thought that her heart had stopped beating as with deliberate slowness she turned her head to see standing by their table the man she had last seen on the stairs of Charles' lodgings. Major Meredith looked, she thought, even more formidable than she had in the dimness of the ill lit landing when she had slipped past him to run down the stairs. Then she told herself there was no need to panic. It had been very dark, and while she knew who he was because Charles had talked about him, why should he connect her in any way with the woman he was now about to meet in the company of the GOC Bombay? Major Meredith shook hands with the general and then walked around the table to Lady Critchley. "How nice to see you, Major," she said in her usual cold voice. "I do not know whether you have met Colonel and Mrs. Onslow, who are traveling to Alexandria." Major Meredith shook them both by the hand and was then introduced to Colonel MacDougall. It gave Orisa time to convince herself that if she only kept her head and behaved quite ordinarily, Major Meredith would not recognize her. "And this is Mrs. Lane," Lady Critchley said almost as if it was an afterthought, "who is traveling to India and has very kindly consented to look after little Nile, my daughter's child, whom we are taking back with us to Bombay." Orisa bowed her head, but didn't attempt to put out her hand. Major Meredith bowed in response. His face was quite expressionless. There was not the slightest gleam of recognition in his grey eyes. I was right, Orisa thought elatedly. He has not recognized me. "Sit down, Meredith," the general commanded, "and tell me the latest news from Khartoum." "There was none when I left London," the major replied. He had a very strange voice, Orisa decided. It was different from any other man's. It was very deep. It seems to have a resonance that awoke some chord of memory which she couldn't quite place. And then she told herself she was being imaginative. "And what news from India?" Lady Critchley asked. "We seem to be out of touch ever since we have been home." "That is what we all feel when we are away," Major Meredith replied. "I see. There is more trouble on the frontier," Colonel Onslow remarked. Major Meredith smiled. "Is there ever anything else? But they say that Russia is only waiting for a suitable moment to march into Afghanistan and capture Herat." "We cannot allow that," the general said positively. "Of course not, sir," Major Meredith agreed. Orisa bent forward to murmur in Lady Critchley's ear, "I think I should go and see if Nile is all right. Yes, of course, Mrs. Lane. Good night, Lady Critchley said. Orissa rose quickly and moved away from the table. Before anyone realized that she was about to do so, and there was no need for the gentlemen to rise to their feet. She walked across the saloon, conscious, as she did so that other passengers having their coffee looked at her as she passed. She managed to appear indifferent to their attention, but when she reached the door, she hurried as quickly as she could to her cabin. She entered, shut the door behind her, and then stood with her back to it, as if it were a protection against what was outside. How could it be possible, she asked herself, that Major Meredith should be on board this particular ship? It must, she thought, have been a chance in a million that they would ever encounter each other again. Yet her heart was still beating violently in her breast from the shock of seeing him so unexpectedly. It would have been impossible to go ashore, and equally impossible to remain in her cabin for the whole voyage. But as it happened, everything was all right. He hadn't recognized her. She was sure of it. I am safe, quite safe, Orissa told herself reassuringly as she started to undress. Yet she found it was impossible to dismiss Major Meredith from her mind. There was something disturbing about him, something, even in the tone of his voice, that affected her. When she got into her bunk, she went over in her mind all the things Charles had told her about him. He will spoil the voyage for me, she told herself. Then, with her natural resilience, she determined she would not allow him to do so. She shut her eyes and thought, as she had thought so often before, of the heat, the color of the fruits and vegetables, the grain in the bazaar, the smell of musk, spices, and ghee, mustard oil, and masala. She could remember the silk shops with their gay bales piles high, the jostling, drifting crowds, the great lazy sacred Brahmani bulls, sacred to Shiva, and over it all the brilliant, burning sunshine, golden and blinding, enveloping her like the love for which she had been starved all these years in the cold and rain of London. Forget Major Meredith, Orissa told herself. It is India that matters. The next day, they ran into bad weather. The ship was rolling and pitching, and Nile began to feel sick from the moment he awoke. He was tearful and irritable between bouts of vomiting, and Orissa, aware at first of a queasy feeling, soon found she had no time to think of herself. The steward brought dismal account of the other passengers. All incapacitated, ma'am, he told Orissa. It's always the same time this year. The dining saloon is deserted. It was impossible for Orisa to leave Nile, so the steward brought their luncheon to the cabin, and she coaxed the child to eat something, knowing it was better to be sick on a full stomach rather than an empty one. She tried to amuse him by telling him a story, but after a while he fell asleep, and she decided it would be a good opportunity to have a little fresh air. By now, it seemed as if she had found her sea legs, and she no longer felt sick, but she had a painful headache from the stuffness of the cabin. She put on her cloak and bonnet, and after asking the steward to look in every 10 minutes or so to see if Nile had awakened, she started an unsteady passage to the more sheltered side of the ship. It was not easy to walk, and she had to hold on to whatever she could on the way. It was impossible to walk about. The sea was so rough and the wind so strong that she knew that if she went near the rail, her cloak might be whipped away from her, and certainly her bonnet would go at the first gust. She could only therefore stand supported against the outside wall of the cabins, sheltered from the rush and spray of the waves, but still encountering some of the more violent blows of the wind, which beat the tendrils of her hair against her cheeks so furiously that they hurt. The noise of the storm prevented her from hearing a door open, and the first intimation that she was not alone came when a deep voice beside her said, "I see you are a good sailor, Mrs. Lane." She turned her head to see Major Meredith standing there, his grey eyes on her face, and she was instantly conscious that she must look untidy. "I'm proud to find that I am," she answered. "I was not certain when I awoke if I would scum like the poor little boy I'm looking after." "He is all right?" Major Meredith inquired. "He is asleep," Orisa replied. She had the strange feeling they were making desultory conversation which was of no importance when they should be speaking of other things. Then she remembered how dangerous Major Meredith could be and how Charles was afraid of him. A sudden lurch of the ship made her stagger for a moment, and Major Meredith's hand went out as he would support her, but he didn't, in actual fact, touch her. Orisa looked away from him towards the green waves at one moment curving high, and next swinging low in a swirl of white crested water. "You look as if you are enjoying it," he said. She thought there was a mocking note in his voice. "I am," she answered simply. "There is something exhilarating and exciting in the ship pitting its strength against all the might of the ocean." "You are not afraid?" I think I should only be afraid if we had to turn back. Orissa replied, That is unlikely, Major Meredith remarked. But it surprises me that you are so glad to leave England. Why? He seemed to consider a moment before he answered. Most women find life in India constricting and narrow. The majority long passionately for home. The word home brought Orissa sharp memories. To me, India is home, she said. She had the feeling that Major Meredith was going to question her further, and because she realized this must not happen, she turned. I must go back to my charge. He may be needing me. She had hardly completed the sentence before a violent roll of the ship made her lose her balance. For one frightening moment, it seemed as if she would slither down the sloping deck and be thrown against the railing over which the water was flooding. She gave a little cry of fright, and at that moment, a strong hand caught her wrist and pulled her back sharply so that she found herself in Major Meredith's arms. It all happened so quickly. The impact of his hard body against the softness of hers made it difficult to breathe, and she found his face very close to hers. She was looking into his grey eyes. Just for a moment, time seemed suspended. Then, with a little inarticulate murmur of apology, Orissa found it possible to reach the door. Without looking back, she hurried to her cabin.